Goodbye, Morgan.
No, Mark. They'll believe you. They must believe you. It was an accident. A mistake. Anybody can make a mistake.
Where the Sidewalk Ends is a fairly typical product of the 20th Century Fox studio of the period late 40s, early 50s. Fox was the studio who were responsible for introducing CinemaScope into their commercial entertainments. They did this as their response, their survival response, to the inroads of commercial television, which had come in America in 1948 and within a couple of years was really hurting the film industry. It's most regrettable from the point of view of art historians, I guess, and film critics, that Fox should have decided on this policy because at that time there was coming out from the studio a very interesting, characteristic product. They weren't B-grade movies. They were being made on comparatively low budgets. They utilised studios. They rarely went into location, and the very best of professionals all the way down through the crew. And the late 40s was probably the high point in American cinema for studio-based drama. The 20th Century Fox program filler was meant to go on after interval, but in a number of cases it would have been on double bills. Occasionally even may have found itself before interval by the time it got out into suburban release. Was a characteristically economical, succinct, even austere kind of film in its tone. The pictorial conventions that were employed were highly rhetorical ones, and they do represent, I think, a peak in the American cinema. The formula is an important part of pictures of this kind. And Where the Sidewalk Ends is an urban film. It's about urban people, their way of life, some of their characteristic conflicts. There is in the plot a measure of contrivance that some people might be inclined to describe as melodramatic. But then, in some ways, that's part of its strength. One of the characteristics of the melodrama is that social issues, points of conflict in society, are internalized. If I could get my tongue around the word, I'd say interiorized within particular characters, so that the rest of the machinery of the drama is worked out in personal, individual terms. But essentially, the significance of films of this kind is that they reflect, in the microcosm of the few people who are the principals, conflicts of values, allegiances, sometimes of ambitions and loyalties, that characterized at least a section of the American community at that time. We see the city skyline at night, the traffic. We see a man in a shadowed doorway. We see a man standing on a corner waiting for the car to pick him up. These are part of the familiar and powerful rhetoric of American cinema at that time. But the main reason that I selected this film to put into the lesson is because I wanted to point to one aspect of a filmmaking technique. It's a most characteristic example of the early work of Otto Preminger. Preminger has attracted more notice, I suppose, and certainly enjoyed more box office success from the time that he branched out as a producer of his own films and became comparatively independent, selecting his own productions, working on them all the way through, even down to marketing. But I think there's a case to say that Preminger's best work was done at a time when he was just one of the studio personnel at Fox, and they handed him whatever was the next project to be done. And Preminger got it done. Now, I don't rightly know what kind of reputation he had at the time, whether he was someone who brought things in under budget or inside schedule or not. I suspect from the regularity with which they were turned out that he was probably a pretty efficient kind of filmmaker from the studio's point of view. The striking characteristic of Preminger's style in this Fox period was that he employed a very mobile camera, a camera that was frequently on the move, prowling restlessly around with the action, but in ways that made it relatively unobtrusive. For the most part, when we want to point to filmmakers whose personal style involves the repeated and, let's say, pronounced reliance upon camera movement, we're likely to think of Max Ophuls in France. Ophuls, by comparison with Preminger, is a much more self-conscious, formalized director in his use of the moving camera. Ophuls characteristically employs the great flowing sine curve. Ophuls used the crane more than he used the dolly. And indeed, in some cases, we can see some evidence that Ophuls probably worked out his camera moves first, his great, elaborate, but elegant crane shots, and then had his sets constructed to fit into those camera moves. Perhaps we think of Skolimowski in Poland, films like Walkover, with very long takes done with travelling camera, through streets, in and out of rooms, buildings, whatever else. And there is a relentless drive ahead sense that comes out of Skolimowski's use of moving camera. Perhaps we think of Jancho in Hungary. Jancho is able to get through an entire feature film in 24 shots. But each of these directors places a much more self-conscious emphasis upon the formal properties of the image. Preminger, in his Fox period, by comparison, was using an unobtrusive sort of camera movement.
Hello, Murphy.
We're late for the ceremony.
Still up in the stride room?
Lieutenant Thomas will be in charge of this precinct. And no one else. So far as you are concerned, he has no superiors. You'll give him your cooperation and your obedience. And I expect this precinct to maintain its present high record with the department under your new lieutenant. Do you wish to make any remarks, Lieutenant?
I'll talk to the men individually.
Good idea. Dixon, I want to talk to you. I'll use your office, Thomas.
Yes, sir.
That's all, boys.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Good luck, Lieutenant. Sit down, Dixon. We've had 12 more legitimate citizen complaints against you this month for assault and battery.
From who? Hoods, dusters, mugs? Not a nickel rats.
You're a big disappointment to me, Dixon. You've just seen a man who started out at the same time you did take a big step up in the department, which is something you'll never do unless you get hold of yourself.
I know what to get hold of, sir. A little more pull.
Sit still. You've got to learn, Dixon, what's expected of a police officer and what isn't.
Yes, sir. I'll try to learn not to hate hoods too much.
You don't hate hoodlums. You like to beat them up. You get fun out of it. You like to read about yourself in the newspapers as the tough cop who isn't afraid to wade in anywhere. Your job is to detect criminals, not to punish them.
Is that all, sir?
I'm reducing your rank, Dixon. You're going back to second grade. Any more complaints against you for cruelty or roughhouse, and you'll be back in uniform, pounding a beat. It's no fun telling you this. You're a good man with a good brain. But you're no good to the department unless you learn to control yourself. All right, you can go now.
Thank you, sir, for the advice.
One of the most striking elements of this kind of filmmaking style is the consistency of the lighting. When you consider the moves themselves by the camera, and add to that the moves of the featured players, we find that there really isn't a jar at any time. The same range of grey tones is sustained, regardless of what movements they may go through. Now, when we see the two main characters come up the staircase into that office where there's a meeting of the policemen, and they're being introduced to their new superintendent, etc. The interesting thing is that the camera seems to have engaged itself in an informal kind of grouping. Dana Andrews, the principal character playing Dixon, actually goes out of frame, or out of frame right. So that when the action requires that he be called across to frame left, the superintendent, played by Robert Simon, at that point merely names him. And then, in a way that observes, for instance, a far higher degree of naturalism than we would find in the films of Ophuls or those other film directors, he's able to get from point A to point B. So these two characters then go into the inner office, and Dixon is going to be well and truly chewed out by the superintendent for his actions. The interesting thing to see there is that, first of all, he places them at such a point that when Simon turns around, it's going to be necessary to cut back to Andrews. Having done that, he then moves toward him. And in doing so, we note that the old classical proportions, the law of thirds, are being observed quite closely. Note, for instance, here, where Simon is gesturing, he occupies the left third of frame. His gesture is in the top third of the left third. Andrews, by comparison at this time, occupies the lower third of the right third of frame. Notice also how the lighting emphasises Simon's gesture at this point. But that's more or less only in passing. Simon then travels to the other side of Andrews. Again swings round, has another point to make. Notice again, the law of thirds is in application. Simon now is in right third, Andrews in left third. Again, the lighting's been arranged, so the emphasis is placed on Simon. If you look across from top right third to lower left third, you get what is the maximum amount of spatial tension that you can get in this form of composition, the standard ratio. Now you might say, look, by itself, that doesn't amount to a great deal, and we have a critical problem on our hands. On one side, we would have to argue that in terms of the dramatic impact in this scene, the relatively strict observance of these classical forms of composition was probably not assisted very greatly. On the other hand, once we become conscious of this, we're aware that the filmmaker has exercised an extraordinary degree of skill, of meticulous preparation, and of its execution by the actors. If we could get a shot of the studio floor at this time, we'd probably find that it's crisscrossed by chalk marks or tape lines or whatever else, and that there's no way that Preminger was going to be able to establish such a fine and exact judgment in the placing of his characters in the frame in relation to the lines that they deliver, unless this had all been worked out, rehearsed most carefully, and then finally executed carefully. Does this make the film better? Well, again, that depends upon your critical approach, I suppose, whether what you're concerned with is that part of aesthetics that looks to beauty, to the qualities that are in the object, in the artifact, or whether you're more concerned with art, that is the achievement of the artist in having put it there. Because in some cases, the most beautiful or admirable works of art are ones that may have been achieved with a relatively low degree of effort on the part of the artist. In some other cases, we may say, and perhaps this scene we just looked at is one of them, that the final product is perhaps not possessed of any exceptional qualities of beauty, cinematic beauty, but that the efforts of the filmmaker and the exactness of his achievement are deserving of some kind of admiration. Well, it depends where you stand. For some of us, we're talking about qualities in the film. Others, we're talking about merits in the artist. I think both of them are quite relevant critical concerns. But for many of us, we tend to get them confused. All right, now let's take a look at a second example.
You got it?
It's blood, all right, quite fresh. I'd say not more than 24 hours.
Get it to the lab right away.
Okay.
That clinches that Payne was killed in his room. Somebody came in there and slugged him. He bumped his head on the floor when he fell. He had a silver plate in his head as a result of a shrapnel wound in the war. The fall must have killed him.
I buy that, Lieutenant.
The killer tried to get the body out, but he was surprised by someone. Probably Dixon when he came through the front door. He ducked behind the staircase here and hid the body. That's the reason for the blood stain on the wall.
If it is Payne's blood.
Now, we'll get the lab report shortly. Now, we can establish the time of the killing is between 12:30, when Payne must have got here, and 3 a.m. when the killer knocked out the watchman on the pier. Hello, Dixon. You know Mr. Gilruth from the DA's office.
Sure, how are you?
Hello. A lot of fancy footwork you did last night, Dixon. You and Mr. Payne.
That couldn't be helped, Lieutenant.
A fairly unobtrusive panning movement to get the figure under the stairs and then to shoot down the hallway. Notice how the figures in the hallway are arranged so that they recede in depth. One of them's obscured. That's the policeman of the doorway. You'll see as the principals move from that position, they go down the hallway away from camera and they turn to frame right to enter a room there that runs off that hall. Notice the timing. Andrews, Dixon, enters the door at the front of the hall at the same time as the other principals enter the door outside. Andrews advances towards that doorway. The camera, in turn, advances towards him. The timing is to arrive at the door just behind him so that our view into the room takes the figure of Andrews in foreground, slightly out of focus, and the three figures that are already inside the room. Because he's slightly out of focus, this may take some of the pictorial ascendance away from him. However, the size of his figure in the frame, and also in some ways the darkness of it, contrasting with the interior being better lit, does give him a kind of prominence and also gives us a special dramatic framing. In other words, the pictorial framing and the dramatic framing have, in a sense, coincided at that point. Then note the three people in the room turn and look at him. So first we have a view of them with their attention directed to each other, and then their eye lines directed towards Andrews. Cut, and he's entered the room. Another example of Preminger style. In this case, a scene which will be carried in its earlier part by a fair reliance upon orthodox cross-cutting between two principals. Then he goes into two-shot for what is the crucial resolution of this scene. And of course it's also a turning point in the film.
Keep the change. Ted Morris. Kenneth Payne called. Don't answer. Maybe he's in the bar. Haven't paged. But I gotta talk to him. It's important. Trying to get Ted Morrison on the phone, huh? Who are you? Detective Dixon, 16th Squad. Get out. Maybe he's trying to win his money back. Don't give me that. He was cleaning up. How much? And he's got to cut me in. After what you did to him? He started it. It's all among friends. Hello. What? He isn't. Well, look, Kenneth Payne wants him to call as soon as he comes in. Well, that's right. I said get out. I don't like cops. Ted Morrison is not going to call you back, Payne. Nobody asked you. Somebody sunk a knife into Morrison. He's dead. Dead? You're lying. Scalise is trying to frame you. Says you knifed him. Go home. Look, I'm trying to help you, Payne. Scalise and his boys are hanging a murder on you. They knocked him off to get their dough back after you left. Come on. Go on. No cop's gonna touch me. Stand up alone, then. I'll stand up when I want it. Get out of here. Get out! Okay, buddy. Come on, let's go. Come on. Hello?
Hello, Mark.
Oh, hello, Paul.
Did you find him? Mark? Mark?
One of the achievements in this scene is that Preminger has been able to cover a number of significant events. Let's say, think of for a moment that this is a synopsis. So what you say is, Payne grabs bottle, attacks Dixon. They struggle. Dixon punches him. Payne falls to the floor. Dixon stands over him. Growls something about, come on, get up, stop fooling kind of thing. The man hasn't moved. He bends down, inspects him, realizes that finally it's happened. There have been 11 citizen complaints against this man in the past month. He's been warned, he's done it again. This time, he's bashed somebody and the man has died. What does he do? His career, whatever else you like to think of, are in the balance at that moment. And the phone rings. From the time Payne picks up the bottle until Dixon goes into that awful moment of truth when he has to consider himself and what's going to happen next, all of the action is covered in one shot.
Okay, buddy. Come on, let's go. Come on.
Once again, for some of us, I guess, we've raised a critical question. We're looking at a particular kind of skill that's been put into operation. The extent to which it's relevant to the action, the extent to which it assists or enhances that action is what we have to ask ourselves. This is where we pass from descriptive criticism into evaluative criticism. And it may very well be that if you follow my line, that we get caught up too much in an admiration for how skillfully it has been done, and that to some extent that may detract from the actual dramatic information and the dramatic progress of the story. Well, that's a bit of a conundrum, and I guess we would all see it a little differently from each other. Another example of Preminger style. In this case, we look at an entire scene which has been shot in one take.
I'm looking for you for an hour, Mark. Scotch and water, Bill. Gotta hand it to Thomas. He wrapped this one up quick. His first job, too. I didn't think he had it in him.
Stop talking like an idiot. He bungled it.
Oh, wait a minute, Mark. That ain't fair.
Don't tell me what's fair. I know. Scalise did it. Scalise did both jobs. Morrison and Payne.
You can't go against the facts, Mark. I bet Chick's Jala confessed the whole job in a day or two.
See you later.
Where you going?
I'm going to get it out of Scalise.
Wait a minute, Mark. You're not on that end of it. You know the boss's orders. He's got a plan on Scalise.
Let me go.
Look, Mark, I'm going to give it to you straight like a friend. I don't like to see you made a monkey out by a girl with a pretty face. You got a record to protect.
You're as dumb as Thomas.
Come on, I'll drive you home.
You're driving me nowhere, you dumb lug. You stick with your boss and his orders. You let me go or I'll paste you.
And now another example. In this case, it's not an entire scene done in one take, but it's a transition between scenes and also a time transition, which has been effected in a single shot, which depends very much upon camera moves.
Good night, boys.
Teletype the following description to Pittsburgh. Age about 36.
Give me communication.
Complexion dark. Height 6'1". Weight 180 pounds. Hair dark, build average.
You look beat, Mark.
Don't you feel good?
Hey, Mark, you awake?
Yeah.
Well, for those of us that are interested in some of the finer points in filmmaking, we might ask the questions about just what exactly was done with the lighting there in order to affect that transition of time. Interestingly, what we have done, when you think about it there, is to break the dramatic illusion, in a sense. We're well aware that night does not turn into day in a passage of seconds. And I think that if we're staying with the action at that point, the impression we'll get is that the entire night has passed. And we get that from two things. I think one of them is that we have become accustomed to this particular convention, whereby a mere change in the light suggests that night has passed and day has arrived, or sometimes the reverse. But the other clue is in the changed appearance of Dixon. Just have a look at this again. See what's happening here. We get him in this shot. Notice how he's dressed. Have a look at collar and tie. See his hair. Right, we stay on the window. We see the lights of the city. When we come back down then, there's Dixon sitting on a bed. We have to presume he has spent a sleepless night. I ask you whether or not the convention has worked successfully in giving you that information. Note how his appearance has changed. A shorthand way. I suppose if we wanted to characterise Preminger's style, we'd have to say that it's probably the most economical, no-nonsense form of narrative filmmaking that any director was using in the American cinema at that time. Another example. In this case, we take a scene that is basically a three-shot. And at certain points in this scene, the director chooses to also, he shot his singles. It's a question then of just at what point, on what line, and for what dramatic reason will there be a cut, rather than to sustain the essential master shot, which has the three principles grouped in it. So we'll take a look at this one.
It's important. Mr. Friedman said to come to the office right away.
Miss Taylor, this is Mr. Dixon and Mr. Klein. They're police detectives.
How do you do?
How do you do? Would you sit down, please, Miss Taylor? We'd like to ask you a few questions.
What would you like to know?
You were with Kenneth Payne last night?
Yes.
You were at a so-called floating crap game in the apartment of a man named Scalisi at the 43rd Street Hotel, is that right?
Yes.
Have you been in touch with Payne this morning?
No.
Have you any idea where he might be?
No, I haven't.
From what we hear, you're pretty well acquainted with Payne.
Yes.
How well? Could you tell us, please?
I'm his wife.
Is that so? But you're living with your father, we understand.
Ken and I separated 3 months ago.
What happened at Scalisi's while you were there?
May I know why you're asking me all these questions?
We'd rather tell you afterward, if you don't mind.
Well, Kenneth was drinking, and we had a quarrel.
I understand he hit you.
Yes.
Did you see him hit Morrison?
No, I didn't. I left.
Where'd you go?
Home.
Take a taxi?
No, I met my father at his stand, a block from the hotel. He's a taxi driver. He drove me to the subway.
Did you hear from Payne after you got home?
Yes, he telephoned.
What'd he say?
I don't know. I hung up.
What time was that?
About 12:30.
Did he call from his house?
No,
How do you know if you hung up without talking to him?
because my father went down to Ken's place after he dropped me.
What for?
Really? Is this necessary?
We think so, Miss Taylor.
Well, I didn't want to tell him anything. But I was crying, and he noticed the bruise.
What'd he say?
He was very angry. He told me before that,
What?
well, that if Ken ever hit me again, he'd beat his head off.
So, you cut into the big close-up for the key line, when Morgan has to confess just what it was that her father had said the night before, though she realises, of course, that it will incriminate him. Now, if we take another look at this. Well, we start in a four-shot, but the character of the manager is going to pass out of the action almost immediately. So, there's our first setup, the three-shot. As the dialogue progresses, we move in tighter, but retain the three-shot. Now, you notice that the camera move itself corresponds to the change in position of Dixon, who's in left frame. Then a further move in, so that Dixon is now out of frame, and we're working on a two-shot. This means that we'll cut back to a single. There's a single of Dixon. Now, by removing him from the frame, actually, even though we know that the ongoing action places him in the physical proximity of the other two, by removing him in this way, the cut does serve a purpose. It serves to separate him spatially. That is in what could be called, I suppose, imaginative space, as distinct from historical or real space. He's now been removed. So then comes the crucial line where Morgan has to incriminate her father. And so we cut to the single of her, which is a big close-up. Cut again to Dixon, so he can ask his questions. Back to Morgan, and then back to the third character. So that what has happened is there that originally what we worked on as a master three-shot has been broken up into its three principles. As the scene progresses, there's a further exchange of dialogue, increased information, increased dramatic tension. Finally it closes, and we're back in that master three-shot once again. Well, that's a little exercise in descriptive criticism. The next step, evaluative criticism, well, I leave that to you. If you have the opportunity, play the scene back. Play it back perhaps even without sound, as we've done just now. See whether or not you agree with the judgments that have been made as to the points where the audience's attention is actually controlled by the choice of edit. Preminger has been singled out by some film critics. Let's say, for instance, a very useful article written by Charles Barr that first appeared in Film Quarterly called CinemaScope and After. That's since been reprinted in anthologies and so forth. Barr makes quite a point of Preminger's style. The more that you leave the action in that wide-angle, long take, the more choices are left open to an audience to decide what it is that they will give their central attention to. In other words, the choices belong to the audience more than they do to the filmmaker. It was as though Preminger were operating on a principle that had been propounded by André Bazin. At the time that Preminger was working in Hollywood, Bazin was actually still formulating some of these ideas. But Bazin's anti-montage politique claims that every time there's a cut which is made for a dramatic purpose, the audience are robbed of their own initiative. Consequently, the filmmaker, if you like, his product that the audience are responding to, becomes to that degree proportionally more authoritarian. And Bazin took his stance from the argument that there should be as much freedom as possible for an audience to interpret the picture that was in front of them. And Preminger is frequently cited as an example of the kind of filmmaker who did allow an audience a much greater plurality of opportunities for choice than other filmmakers. Now, what I'd like to look at now are two more examples where a scene has been covered mainly by a travelling shot and a few cut-ins have been organised, so that if we follow the scene through fully, we're given what amounts almost to a maximum amount of information about the space itself and the spatial relationships of the characters to each other. So he still has to make choices about camera angle and framing of, how many principles he's going to put in this shot. But that he will return to his master shot, which is a dolly. It's a travelling shot, which is going to encompass the acting space. The acting space in each case being defined by, well, we don't really see four walls. We have to assume that they're all there. So we'll look at two examples of this now.
Who is it?
Wooly.
Makes my point. Come on, ain't the hard way. 2 4s.
7 the loser.
You're very lucky tonight, Mr. Morrison.
Must be the little lady. Brought me luck.
Your dice, Mr. Payne.
Pat.
Your dice, Mr. Morrison.
Okay, I'll shoot 3,000.
I'll take 1. I'll take 500 of it.
I'll take the rest. You're covered.
Hello.
Care to join our game, Mr. Bender?
Sure.
How are things?
Oh, fine.
Say.
Bumped in a couple old friends of ours, Dixon and Klein. They asked about you, but I think they're too busy to drop in.
Too bad.
All right, come on, Dice. Give it to me. A 6 right back. Here we go. 6. Hand.
Mr. Morrison is from Texas and very rich.
Here, you breathe on. Oh, that'll do it. Now, you got Lady Luck riding with you, Dice. This is it, a 6. Give it to me. There it is, a 6.
And getting richer.
6 is my lucky number. I'll shoot the whole 6,000.
You taking any, gentlemen?
A grand.
Same here.
4 open.
You're covered, Mr. Morrison.
Well, I like your friends, Mr. Payne. Can't get better action than this in Amarillo. All right, Dice, now we're going for the big money. Come! Well, what do you know? A 7.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go home, Mr. Morrison.
Morgan.
Ken, you know I have to be at work at 8:30.
Well, that's right. You can't keep a working girl up all hours.
Then I'll take you home, Morgan.
We'll all go together. I'll get your things. There you are.
Mr. Morrison.
Yes, sir.
You're 19 grand into it.
Well, that's all right. You'll get it back some other night. I ain't leaving town for a week.
Tell him you changed your mind. You want to stay.
No, Ken. I told you I could only stay until midnight.
But you can't do this to me.
I'm not doing anything to you.
I brought him here.
Oh. So that's it.
Yes, that's it. And you're fouling me up again. That's all you ever do is foul me up. You're telling him to stay.
No, I'm not.
Why, you... Morgan.
That scene was our introduction to the character of Scalisi. The central action of the film derives much of its tension from Dixon's personal crusade against Scalisi. And we find that Preminger uses a related technique in order to film what is their last confrontation.
Sit down, Mr. Dixon. I told the boys you'd come alone. That's because I understand you, Mr. Dixon. What I don't understand is your reason for calling on me at this time. I said, sit down. I never saw a man as full of hate as you. I consider it almost humorous the way you came hot-footing it after me alone. I'm in the clear on the Morrison job. The police are satisfied to let me alone. But you're still hot on my neck, as always. Sit down, Dixon. I'm not kidding. It don't add up, Dixon, you staying on my neck like this. Maybe you thought you could start me running by coming after me. Well, we're not running, Dixon. We're all fixed to leave tomorrow morning. Passports in order and everything. And I'm leaving you locked in here. It'll give us something to laugh about. You sitting here for a couple of days trying desperately to attract attention. It'll maybe give the department a laugh, too. Well, go ahead, Mr. Dixon. You came out here for something. Let's hear what it is. You've got something on your mind, the way you look, Mr. Dixon.
Yes, well, I think the excerpts that we've looked at would be sufficient to work on as part of a study project, perhaps. I think the nicest way to wind up this lesson would be to give you an example of Preminger employing a much more traditional form of cross-cutting.
They got Steve. They beat it out of him. If you let go, the whole work's about Morrison.
Come on. I haven't finished the bandage.
Let up bleed. Come on.
Get the elevator.
Press the emergency buttons.
Power's off. We're stuck.
That dirty cop.
Well, that's as many examples as I want to show you in this lesson. The problem that remains from the point of view of doing a practical crit is whether or not you regard this as a sufficient critical exercise, or whether we should have looked at what the story is about, what does it say, what are its qualities as a whole, what were the intentions and the final achievements of the filmmaker, things of that kind. Yes, fair enough, but at the present time anyway, in the present state of film criticism, I think that more exercises of the kind we've done just now, which are essentially descriptive, really do need to be put on record.
Goodbye, Morgan.
No, Mark. They'll believe you. They must believe you. It was an accident, a mistake. Anybody can make a mistake.
You mean you'll give Sandy Dixon's kid another chance?
Every chance in the world.
That's enough to live for.